My family stole $12,000 from my savings for my addict sister. Years later, they demand I quit college to raise the son she abandoned for drugs. But my answer left them speechless. I'm 21 years old, studying civil engineering in my final year of college on a full scholarship, and honestly, I need to get this out because what happened a few weeks ago has me completely wrecked. Like I can't concentrate in my classes, and every time my phone rings, I get anxiety. The thing is that my family basically wants me to give up everything I've built to fix the massive mess my older sister created. And when I say mess, I mean a monumental mess that involves an abandoned child, drugs, and years of favoritism that finally exploded in my face. I guess I should start from the beginning, so you understand why I'm so furious. I have an older sister, Natalie, who's 3 years older than me, and our entire lives, she's been my parents' golden child despite being literally a walking disaster. And I'm not just saying that. I mean, this girl got expelled from school in 10th grade for selling drugs in the bathrooms, caused car accidents because she drove high, bullied me constantly when we were kids, like she'd hide my stuff and tell my parents I'd lost it. And every time she screwed up, my parents would just clean up the mess and act like nothing happened. I, on the other hand, was always the responsible daughter, you know? Got good grades, worked part-time since I was 16 to save money, never caused problems, basically was the perfect daughter any parent would want. But for some reason, my parents were always more worried about Natalie and her constant crises. When I was 18, and in my senior year of high school, I spent months preparing for college entrance exams. I'd wanted to study civil engineering since I was like 14. It was my dream. And there was this amazing university about 3 hours from home that had one of the best programs in the country. I worked so hard, stayed up late, studying, took extra courses, did volunteer work to strengthen my application. Honestly, I put my whole soul into it, and it worked. Because in March of that year, I got the acceptance letter plus a full scholarship for academic performance that covered tuition, books, everything. I cried when I opened that envelope, couldn't believe I'd done it, and ran to tell my parents thinking they'd be super proud of me. My mom hugged me and said she was happy for me. My dad seemed pleased too, but there was something weird in his expression, like he was nervous about something. I didn't think much of it at the time because I was too excited. I had saved up like $12,000 from years of working part-time, weekends, entire summers. That money was for housing and food expenses during college, since the scholarship didn't cover that. I'd put every cent in a savings account my parents had helped me open when I was 16, one of those minor accounts where they were technically co-signers until I turned 18. But it was supposed to be my money for my education. 2 weeks after getting my acceptance letter, my parents called me for a family meeting. I thought maybe they wanted to celebrate or talk about plans for moving to college. I don't know, something normal. But when I sat down in the living room and saw their faces, I knew something bad was coming. My dad cleared his throat and said, "We need to talk about your savings account." And I automatically felt my stomach sink because why would we need to talk about that? Then my mom dropped the bomb. Turns out Natalie was 4 months pregnant. She was going to marry her boyfriend Joshua, who basically had no stable income, and they had decided the best solution was to buy them an apartment so they could start their life together responsibly. The thing is, they didn't have money for the down payment on the apartment, you know, because for years they'd spent thousands and thousands of dollars getting Natalie out of trouble, paying her fines, fixing the cars she crashed, paying lawyers when she got arrested for drug possession, basically throwing money into a bottomless pit. So, my dad looked at me and said, "We've decided to use your savings account for your sister's apartment, but don't worry because we're going to pay you back eventually." I sat there processing what I'd just heard, and I swear it felt like I was in a surreal movie because what they were saying couldn't be real. I told them, "That's my money. I worked for years to save it. I need it for college." And my mom had the nerve to tell me, "Well, honey, you have a full scholarship, so you don't need as much money as your sister who has a baby on the way." I tried to reason with them, explained that even though I had a full scholarship, I still needed money for rent, food, transportation, books that weren't covered, emergencies. But my dad simply said the decision was already made and that they were co-signers on the account, so technically they could do whatever they wanted with the money until I turned 18, which was going to be in 2 months, but apparently they weren't going to wait. I yelled at them, cried, told them it wasn't fair, that once again Natalie got everything, while I, who had done things right, got nothing. But my mom just kept repeating that family supports each other and that someday I'd understand. 2 days later, the money disappeared from my account. The $12,000 that had cost me 3 years of hard work, it just evaporated to buy a 2-bedroom apartment for my irresponsible sister and her druggy boyfriend. I locked myself in my room and cried for hours, called my best friend and told her everything. She was as outraged as I was. I seriously considered rejecting the scholarship and not going to college out of pure spite. But then I realized that would be exactly what they wanted, for me to stay home to be available for whatever Natalie needed. So I made a decision. I was going to college anyway, and I'd manage however I could. I got a part-time job on campus, took out a small student loan to cover first-year housing expenses, and in August I left for college determined to cut ties with my family as much as possible. What I didn't expect was that they would literally convert my bedroom into a nursery. I went back home in October to pick up some things I'd left behind and discovered my posters had been taken down. My bed replaced with a crib. My bookshelves filled with diapers and baby clothes. My mom told me very casually, "Oh yeah, we decided it was better to use your room for Aiden since you don't live here anyway." Aiden was Natalie's baby, who'd been born in September. I asked her where I was supposed to sleep when I came to visit, and she said I could use the living room couch. That was the moment I knew that for them I simply no longer existed as a daughter. I was just a backup resource for when Natalie needed it. For the next 2 years, I barely had contact with my family. I'd call them on Christmas and birthdays because I felt obligated, but the conversations were tense and superficial. They never asked how I was doing in college, if I needed anything, nothing. Instead, every conversation somehow ended up being about Natalie and how difficult it was being a young mother, or about how Joshua couldn't keep a job, or about how baby Aiden had colic and they had to go help constantly. I'd just say, uh-huh, and end the call as quickly as possible. I focused on my studies, made incredible friends at college, got summer internships that paid well, basically built a life completely separate from them and was honestly much happier. Then, like 3 weeks ago, on a Tuesday night, I was studying for a super important soil mechanics exam worth 30% of my final grade, and my phone started ringing like crazy. It was my mom. I let it go to voicemail because I was focused. She called again. I ignored it again. Then my dad called. Then my mom again. Then I got like 10 text messages in a row saying, "Answer the phone. It's an emergency. We need you to come home now." My heart started racing because I thought someone had died or something. So I finally answered, and my mom was literally hysterical on the other end, crying and screaming that I needed to come home immediately, that it was a family emergency, and I had to be there tomorrow morning, without fail. I asked her what had happened, and she just kept repeating, you have to come now. I can't explain over the phone." I told her I had an exam in 2 days that I couldn't miss. It was literally one of the most important exams of my degree, and I'd been preparing for weeks. But she started screaming that I always put school before family, and that this time, I needed to be present. My dad took the phone and told me in a super serious tone that if I didn't come tomorrow morning, I was going to regret this decision for the rest of my life, that something terrible had happened with Natalie and they urgently needed my help. I told them I couldn't, that I'd take the exam on Thursday and come on Friday, and my dad literally hung up on me. I tried to keep studying but couldn't concentrate. I was shaking, and my mind wouldn't stop imagining what could have happened. Did Natalie have an accident? Was she in the hospital? Had she died? But if it was something like that, they would have told me over the phone, right? That night, I didn't sleep at all. Wednesday was torture, trying to focus on reviewing for the exam, while my phone wouldn't stop ringing with increasingly aggressive calls and messages from my parents telling me I was a selfish daughter, that when they needed me, I simply ignored them, that after everything they'd done for me, I couldn't even come when there was a real emergency. That made me so angry because everything they'd done for me, they stole my savings, converted my room into a nursery, basically erased me from the family. But sure, I was the selfish one. Thursday, I took my exam. I think I did well, but honestly, I wasn't at my best mentally. As soon as I finished, I threw some things in a backpack. I got in my car, a 2015 Honda Civic I'd bought myself with money from my internships, and drove the 3 hours to my parents' house. I arrived around 6 in the evening, and when I knocked on the door, my mom opened it with red eyes from crying so much. She pulled me inside and took me to the living room where my dad was sitting with a funeral face. On the couch, there was a handwritten note that obviously had been read 1,000 times because it was all wrinkled. My mom told me, "Sit down and read this," and handed me the note. It was Natalie's handwriting. I recognized it immediately because it was that slightly slanted writing she always had. The note said something like, "Mom and Dad, I can't do this anymore. Aiden deserves more than I can give him. I'm leaving him with Caroline," meaning me, because she was always the responsible one. "She'll know what to do. Don't try to find me. Joshua and I need time to work out our stuff. I'll let you know when we're ready to come back. Love you, Natalie." I sat there staring at that paper, feeling my brain trying to process what I'd just read, and then I looked at my parents and asked, "Where's Aiden?" And my mom pointed toward the room that used to be mine, where apparently the kid was sleeping. The full story they told me was worse than I imagined. Turns out on Monday at dawn, someone knocked on my parents' door at like 5 in the morning. My dad went down half asleep and found Aiden in his car seat on the porch with a diaper bag and that note pinned to his clothes. Natalie and Joshua had simply left the kid and taken off. Just like that. My parents had tried calling them 1,000 times, but both had their phones off. They went to the apartment they'd bought them with my money, and it was completely empty. They'd taken everything and disappeared without a trace. My mom was sobbing, saying she didn't understand how her daughter could abandon her own son, that something terrible must have happened. And I was sitting there thinking, really? You didn't see this coming? This is literally the same person who got expelled from school, who crashed cars while high, who's been irresponsible her entire life? And you're surprised she abandoned her kid? Then my dad cleared his throat and said the part that really made me explode. He told me, "The note says she's leaving him to you, Caroline. Clearly Natalie knew you'd be the best option to care for Aiden. So we need you to take a semester off from college and come home to take care of him until Natalie returns." I stared at him like he'd grown a second head and said, "You're joking, right?" He explained very seriously that no, that they couldn't care for a 2-year-old full-time because my mom worked and my dad had back problems. That besides they'd already done their part raising children and now it was my turn, that it was my family responsibility to support in this crisis. I told them they were completely insane if they thought I was going to abandon my final year of college, my career, my entire life to clean up Natalie's mess again. I reminded them they'd stolen my savings to buy her an apartment, that they'd converted my room into a nursery, that for 2 years they hadn't even asked how I was, and now they wanted me to sacrifice everything because their favorite daughter had turned out to be exactly the disaster we all knew she was. My mom started crying harder, saying this wasn't about favoritism, that it was about an innocent child who needed care. And I told her they were absolutely right. Aiden needed care, professional care from social services who could find him an adequate home while they located his negligent parents. I mentioned we should call CPS, the police, report this as child abandonment. And my dad turned red with rage and yelled at me that there was no way he was going to allow the government to take his grandson, that it would destroy the family, that it would go on Natalie's record and ruin her life when she came back. And I yelled back that maybe Natalie deserved to have that on her record because she'd abandoned her child, that this wasn't normal, that something was very wrong. That's when they finally told me the full truth they'd been hiding for months. Turns out Natalie and Joshua were addicted to hard drugs, specifically methamphetamines, and had been using for at least a year. My parents knew it. They'd seen the signs. They'd even gone to the apartment several times and found Aiden alone in his crib with an unchanged diaper for hours while Natalie and Joshua were high in the living room. Instead of calling authorities or doing something useful, my parents simply started going daily to take care of Aiden, clean the apartment, bring them food, basically enabling the situation to continue. They told me all this as if they were heroes for having protected Natalie, and I was absolutely horrified. I asked them how they could be so irresponsible, how they could have allowed a child to live in those conditions, and my mom said they were trying to get Natalie into rehab, but she refused. Then they told me their plan was for me to come home, take charge of Aiden, and meanwhile they'd keep trying to locate Natalie to convince her to enter rehab, and when she was clean and ready I could return to college, as if it were that simple. I told them no, absolutely not. That they had created this monster by enabling Natalie's behavior for decades without real consequences, and that I wasn't going to be part of this dysfunctional cycle. My mom begged me, literally on her knees, saying that if I didn't help, they'd have to call CPS, and Aiden would end up in the system, in a foster home with strangers, and that I'd have to live with that guilt the rest of my life. I explained to them this wasn't my fault, that I hadn't made any of the decisions that led to this point, that they had chosen to prioritize Natalie over everything else for years, and these were the consequences of those choices. I told them, I thought, What was happening to Aiden was terrible, that I really cared about the kid, but that the solution wasn't for me to destroy my future to become an emergency substitute mother. I insisted they call Child Protective Services, do things correctly, that maybe that way Natalie would finally face real consequences that would motivate her to change. My dad told me that if I insisted on that, if I called the authorities, our relationship would end forever, that they'd be cutting me off completely from the family, because I would have betrayed my own sister and nephew. And honestly, in that moment, I realized there was no family left to save. I told them to do what they had to do, that I was going back to college to finish my final year, that I hoped they'd make the right decision and call the authorities, but that if they chose to keep Aiden, then it was their responsibility to find a way to care for him, not mine. I left that house at 10 at night and drove back to college crying the whole way, feeling this horrible mix of relief for standing my ground and guilt for leaving a small child in that situation. I spent that whole week waiting for them to call, telling me they'd contacted CPS, but I didn't get any calls. Finally, I sent them a message asking what they'd decided, and my mom responded that they'd applied for temporary custody of Aiden, that they'd hired a lawyer, and that they were seeking official help to locate Natalie to force her into rehab or face abandonment charges. That was 3 weeks ago. Since then, I've received probably 50 messages from unknown numbers, presumably distant relatives my parents mobilized, telling me I'm a heartless monster. How can I abandon my nephew? That family comes first, all that crap. I've blocked most of the numbers, but new ones keep appearing. An aunt I hadn't even seen in 5 years sent me a message saying that when I have kids and need help, no one's going to be there for me because I'm showing I don't value family. It's exhausting and sometimes makes me doubt if I did the right thing. But then I remember they literally stole thousands of dollars from me, erased my existence from the family home, and only remembered me when they needed me to solve Natalie's mess. Last week, I ran into an old friend from high school who still lives in my town, and she told me my parents told everyone that I refused to help with my nephew because I'm selfish and only care about my career. She said a lot of people in town are talking about me, saying horrible things. Part of me wants to scream the truth. Tell them about the stolen savings, about how my parents covered up Natalie's addiction and child neglect, about decades of favoritism, but the other part of me just wants to move on and not look back. I graduate in 6 months. I have job offers from 2 different engineering firms that pay very well, one here in this city and another in a completely different state 5 hours from my town. I'll probably accept the one, that's farther away. I need distance from all this. Sometimes at night I think about Aiden and wonder how he is, if he's okay, if he misses his mom, if someday he'll understand what happened. I wonder if I did the right thing or if I should have sacrificed my future to give him stability. But then I remember I can't save everyone, that it's not my responsibility to clean up messes others created, and that setting boundaries doesn't make me a bad person, even though my family has made me feel that way my whole life. I haven't spoken to my parents since that night. I don't know if I'll ever speak to them again. I guess that's the part that hurts the most. Not so much losing the relationship with Natalie, because honestly we never had a real relationship, but losing my parents, or rather finally accepting that the relationship I thought we had never really existed. For them, I was always the backup daughter, the one who could be ignored when everything was going well, but from whom they expected everything when there was a crisis. And now that I finally said no, turns out I'm the villain of the story. It's shit, honestly, but I'm trying to make peace with all this and focus on finishing my degree and starting my real life, far away from all this toxicity.